Hey, I'm Niyantha Shekar and I'm a writer and director. In this episode of Learn Something New, I'm going to talk about my process for writing a script for non-fiction branded content. Whenever I read a really good brief, ideas start popping up. So what I do is I just write these ideas down so that I can kind of come to it later, because in a sense these are my purest, unfiltered ideas where I'm not thinking about constraints, I'm not thinking about budget. And what these ideas tend to do is they tend to guide my curiosity as well towards the second step of the process, which is research. I kind of look at it as there's three aspects to it. The first one is the secondary research, which is basically scouring the internet for as much information as I can get about the subject. So there was a documentary series that I did collaborating with Supari Studios and with RedBull called The Mind Behind. So I thought I would take the example of our Emiway Bantai episode from The Mind Behind to kind of break down my process. The kind of research I did was to first just listen to all the music Emiway's created, watch all his music videos, read his lyrics closely to understand the kind of stories he likes to tell through his music, watch a ton of documentaries about the evolution of hip-hop, the evolution of hip-hop in India. I mean, a ton of notes. I kind of filed all this information. What this process does is it helps me immerse myself in the world of the subject, in the world of the protagonist, and leads me to my second step, which is the primary research, where I'm talking to the character. And I basically have a ton of questions prepared, and I have a long conversation with the protagonist, in this case Emiway. Emiway took me to a bunch of locations that are important to him. What's really cool about this part of the process is that you get to see a side of the character, you get to hear stories and insights that you wouldn't hear from them if it was just a phone call or if you're meeting them in a cafe. In this case, Emiway took us to the terrace where he jams with his friends.
जब मैं फ्री स्टाइल करता हूँ, my mind is free. मैं रुकता नहीं हूँ, I don't stop. यहाँ पे रुकने का नहीं, सिर्फ चलते रहने का.
He took us to the underground studio above a bus stop where he produces his music.
There's a studio in Sion. स्टूडियो बस डिपो के ऊपर, और मेन सीन ये है कि रात को हम लोग फ्रीस्टाइल करते थे.
As I'm seeing these places, ideas come up, treatment ideas come up, narrative ideas come up, and I'm just like making notes throughout. I'm making tons of notes throughout. And at the end of this process, I have all the information. I've cast a very wide net by this point, and it's finally time to start writing. So that's step 3. The first thing that I do before actually writing down the script is to get the audio interviews transcribed, and then I read the interview transcripts very closely, and I highlight key points, key lines, key pieces of dialogue. And as I'm doing this, a skeleton structure for the script starts forming in my head. So for example, for Emiway, the skeleton structure is something like we have a cold open, and then we'll move into his origin story. Then we'll go into absorbing sounds from the hood, which was the way he picked up the slang and the lingo that he uses for his rap. Moving into breaking down the craft of rap and freestyle from his perspective. And then finally building this dichotomy of Bilal versus Emiway. I had the skeleton structure in place, and then the next thing I did was I started pulling out lines from the transcript and lines that are relevant to these different sections that I listed. And then I start fleshing out scenes. And so by the time I'm done with this process, about 70 to 80% of the first draft is done. And the final bit to this is finding the visual, narrative, oral transitions from one section to another. I think the cool thing that we get to do as filmmakers or writing for film is that we get to exploit the full range of the craft. And so what I looked to do in terms of transitioning in the Emiway Bantai episode was to use contrast and energy and sound as a transitioning technique. So if you see the episode, there is a cold open where you see him walking out onto the terrace, and he begins to rap, and then there is if you look at the graph of that scene, it starts going up, and it ends with him saying Emiway Bantai Malumena. And at that point, at that high point, it cuts to an empty space with an empty chair, and then Emiway walks in and takes a seat. And so what that does is it creates this high point and then cuts to something that is completely at odds with what you've seen. And I try to do this throughout the script. I'm trying to build each scene to a high point and then cut to a space, a tone, a mood that is at odds with what you've just seen. So that was a technique, a transitioning technique that I kind of baked into the script. The idea is that by the time the script is done and I'm narrating it or people are reading it, there's a film playing in my head, there's a film playing in the head of the DP, of the client, of the producer, of the AD, so that by the time they see the final film, there is very few surprises. So I guess one final thing I'd like to touch upon is the fact that we are working on non-fiction stories with real people telling their real stories and not actors. And so the idea of a script for non-fiction may sound odd. The idea is that the script is not something that you hand over to your characters in the film and ask them to say what's there in the script. These are things that they've already told me in my research when talking to them. And so my job on the day of the shoot is to just cue them to talk about those things they've already spoken to me about and to say it in the way that makes most sense to them on that day. And in a sense, when you're editing the film, you're rewriting the film again. So your script basically is a guide. It's the more detailed it is, the more planned out it is. It just makes the execution of the film so much easier in terms of shot breakdowns, in terms of location requirements, in terms of knowing exactly what we need, getting it, and then moving on to the next thing, because you're often working with very little time. So yeah, that is my writing process for non-fiction, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks.